Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's really my pleasure to welcome you all to our leadership webinar series in partnership with the Center for Creative Leadership. With me today, dear colleagues and amazing people that I've gotten to know, Dr. Cheryl Flink, Dr. Katia Fernandez, and also Mr. Sufyan Al-Amali, and myself, Abdullah Zahrani, welcoming you to this webinar. In today's webinar, we are going to explore an area that is very crucial and critical for all of us, especially in these times of fluctuating and rapid changes that are taking place in the world. These changes are really impacting us all. And today we are going to look at these changes and the dynamics that are taking place around us from the lens of leadership development, specifically focusing on leadership resilience. And we are going to talk about this area in more details. Can we go to the next slide, Katia, please? So in this webinar, we are going to explore the latest research on how can leaders prepare to deal for the new world of work? How can we prepare our workforce for this new reality? And also, how is resilience relevant in the Saudi business world? I believe that we are part of this world. We are impacted by it. However, we do believe that there are some contextual, I would say, contextual elements that are at play that we need to pay attention to. And I believe that Mr. Sufyan, as being the global head of leadership development at SABIC, is seeing the lens from both the local in Saudi Arabia as well as the global side, looking at leadership development in a renowned Saudi company as SABIC. Also, Dr. Katia Fernandez, the research scientist in the CCL, is going to share with us the latest research in this area. And also, Dr. Cheryl Flink is going to share with us CCL's basically approach and efforts to advance the leadership research in the market. So with no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Cheryl, who will take us through the basically research that is currently being shaped in CCL to advance leadership development in the world. Dr. Cheryl.
I better take myself off of mute. I would have learned that habit by now with the past year spent on Zoom. So good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I have this wonderful opportunity to speak to you today to tell you more about the research that CCL does and the team that I lead. I have to say I'm very privileged to have this role. I think you can all envy me for this wonderful work that we are able to lead, understanding what will leadership development require for today and tomorrow. So I'd like to tell you about that and think about, and cut you next slide, yes, how research, the balance we must have of providing relevant research to address leadership development right now, imagining even the midst of COVID, versus anticipating what will be needed 5 years from now or a decade from now. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit, give you a taste of both. For the future, we're investing in a number of research projects that involve new methodologies, particularly in the area of artificial intelligence. So the methodologies we use to understand leadership profiles, the challenges and competencies that are needed today, they're all significantly changing because we're using an AI-based approach. Other things are that we're keenly aware of the things that are happening now around systemic racism and how that particularly impacts our US culture. And we have a large body of research in women's leadership, which has clear investment in the Middle East. We're also working with clients to develop leadership profiles of the future. And we're actually working with a client right now, helping answer questions like 10 years from now, what will leadership look like in a global multinational company? So we're thinking both near and far in what the world will need to develop their leadership programs and how to invest in leadership development. We also know that right now, organizations are reconsidering their investments in democratizing leadership development, really focusing on identifying and preparing the leaders of tomorrow and looking for that talent that exists up and down the hierarchy. We see a shift from the development emphasis on competencies to more behavior-based models and using new tools and even digital virtual reality for developing leaders. And finally, we continue to invest in core areas of research in neuroscience. So today you're going to hear from Dr. Katya Fernandez on her work in resilience, which has been focusing on a really fascinating new topic and practice called cognitive reframing, and thinking about how resilience can help leaders burn bright in the midst of a pandemic. And I bet all of us have faced a few challenges to our ability to burn bright as we deal with everything that's happening over the past year. I also thought in this, we would tell you a little bit about CCL and our history of research. As you can tell, we have had over 50 years of research behind the mission of CCL, which is to create the new knowledge that advances our field and that positively transform the way leaders, their organizations, and their societies confront the most difficult challenges of the 21st century. Now, this mission was created some time ago, not ever knowing that COVID would be happening, and we are now facing one of the most difficult challenges of the 21st century. So we remain on point in investing. Our team includes groups of people who come from social psychology, industrial organizational psychology, clinical psychologists, data scientists, evaluation experts. It's a very multidisciplinary team. And then, of course, creates great joy as we work together and learn from one another and contribute to our research. And then the other thing that I'll mention is that we have a microsite called cclinnovation.org, where we have literally hundreds of academic and popular press publications based on our work. And you can find many things there. The last thing I wanted to say was, as a part of that work, we have a publication called the CCL Executive Outlook that comes out every year. The newest one is focused on leadership in disruptive times. And in this particular slide, you can see in the introduction from our wonderful CEO, John Ryan, and a table of contents that reviews many of the topic areas that our research is focused on over the past year. So it's very fresh, very new, gives you a sense of all of the things that we are doing in this area, and also provides you with content that you can go and look at. In some cases, there's actually practices that you can look at, but it's a place to get curious and browse. It's not short, it's over 50 pages long, but that's why it's set up so you can browse and you can really spend time on the things that interest you. With that, I'm going to turn this session over to Katya Fernandez, who will take us into this work on leadership resilience.
Thank you, Cheryl, and hello, everyone. I'm Katya Fernandez, research scientist at the Center for Creative Leadership. And just a little bit about myself, my background is actually in clinical psychology. Cheryl mentioned that some of our team are clinical psychologists. So a lot of my work before coming to CCL focused on things like anxiety and depression, the assessment and treatment of anxiety and depression, how to assess and track emotion regulation. And I wanted to be a part of my contribution to leadership development, wanted to be bringing some of that knowledge and some of that work that's being done in that field over to the leadership development field and to apply some of those concepts to leaders and leadership. And so today we have a piece of that application, which is resilience and specifically cognitive reappraisal, which I'll introduce momentarily. I want to, we've talked about this a little bit so far, but just give a brief nod to the impact of COVID-19, which I'm sure that we're all very intimately aware with over the past year. And here, just to note what the research is emphasizing. So COVID-19, as we know has taken a personal and professional toll. Research has found that just over the last year, published in late 2020, folks are reporting increased anxiety, depression, psychological distress, and stress. This makes sense. There are a lot of changes, a lot of unknowns, a lot of huge shifts in workplace and work requirements for people as a lot of organizations tried to move toward this increased safety of people in the middle of a pandemic. We also know from some research that women and youth have been disproportionately affected by a lot of these changes. In terms of leadership and the workplace, we've seen evidence that leaders are reporting stress and burnout, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the first bullet. We've seen this in our own research at the Center for Creative Leadership, where we've asked leaders, how are you doing? How burnt out are you? Reporting significant levels there of stress and burnout as well. Just to give a quick poll to see where we currently here today as an audience are, just a yes or no question. I'm curious, and I'll start a poll here in Zoom in a second. How many of you have experienced high stress and anxiety during the last month, at any point over the last 12 months? And it's should be live now for you to be able to vote. And I'll give us a couple minutes. Okay, looks like about 3/4 have voted, and the results appear to be 74% saying yes, they have experienced high stress or anxiety in the last 12 months. This is consistent with what we see, and just to validate that experience, and as we just noticed by a comment in the chat, definitely understandable given the tremendous uncertainty and disruptive changes for a lot of individuals across a variety of different industries, organizations, both professionally and personally at home and in the workplace. Now let's turn to the topic of resilience, which is the main concept being discussed today. And I want to start by defining resilience, which we have here in quotes. Resilience, the way that we think about it, is responding adaptively to challenges. And this is a pretty broad definition intentionally to capture the idea that challenges can range from minor annoyances to really, really significant challenges. So if you think of it as being sort of on a continuum or spectrum, challenges can range from being bored or uninspired at work or having just a slow day, all the way to, significant illness, significant changes, the loss of a loved one. I mean, anywhere along that continuum, we face a variety of different challenges as we go about our daily lives. And the idea is that resilience is characterized as responding adaptively to the challenges in a way that's helpful to you, that helps you meet the goals that you want to meet and essentially be your best self, which is the first sentence here. Now, the way that we've been thinking at CCL about resilience is we wanted to get a little bit more structure around resilience. Now that we have a definition for it, what does it look like theoretically? What does it look like in practice if I wanted to try to work on building my resilience, for example? Before I jump into that, I want to just build a case for why we think resilience is even something worth looking at. We found in the literature that resilience in general has been reported to relate to higher life satisfaction and well-being, lower depression in some studies. In the context of leadership, we see that resilience has been found to relate to better performance, higher levels of job satisfaction and organizational commitments, lower levels of burnout, which is particularly important during this time of increased stress, anxiety, and burnout for a lot of individuals. And so just from our history of resilience and the many years of research of people looking into it, we have evidence that, hey, this could be something that's really important to take a closer look at now to try to get more clarity on. So how do we think about resilience? Here I'm presenting to you a relatively recent model. Actually, an upcoming book will discuss this in a lot more detail by myself and two colleagues, Marian Ruderman and Kathleen Clerkin. But it's essentially a framework that we've called the Comprehensive Resilience Framework, or CORE for short. And in this framework is the idea that resilience is a whole self effort. It's something that encompasses multiple areas of well-being. It's something that encompasses who you are both in and outside of the workplace. And it's something that we can think about as being relevant to your physical, your mental, your emotional, and your social self. Now, theoretically, knowing that, okay, resilience encompasses all of these parts of well-being, parts of self is helpful. What does it look like in practice, though? And here is where the 8 different resilience practices can come in. So here we have the exact same figure, but now we have 8 different practices listed on the figure. Starting from the top purple quadrant, we see exercise or physical activity more broadly, sleep, mindfulness, reappraisal, savoring, gratitude, social connections, and contact or social contact. Now, these 8 different practices were selected for a couple of reasons. First, because there is research, actual empirical support showing that they're effective in promoting well-being in a variety of different settings. Secondly, they were selected because they are shown to be effective in the context of leadership specifically. So for every one of these practices, we can point to studies or research showing that within the population of leaders, within the context of leadership, they can help produce positive outcomes. So we've highlighted these 8 as a starting point for this kind of a framework, but just 8 things that we can do every day that are practical tools to help us cultivate and build that resilience. Now, I would love to walk through all 8 today, but that would take a lot more time than we have. So what I'm going to do instead is to focus on just one of these practices and to introduce the practice to you, walk you through why it might be helpful or important, and then what you could do if you were interested in applying a practice like this and incorporating it into your day-to-day life. And I'm going to focus specifically on cognitive reappraisal, which might be one of the lesser known ones out of this list. Now, I'm going to provide a formal definition of reappraisal in a bit, but what I wanted to do, at least for us to be on the same page, is when we think of reappraising, we can just think of it as another word for reinterpreting. When I have a situation, I have an initial interpretation of that situation, what's going on, what people are doing, what my role in that situation is. And what reappraisal essentially is the process of reinterpreting that situation. So rather than going with my initial interpretation, whatever that might have been, thinking about it a little bit more intentionally and purposefully, and thinking about reinterpreting it. Now, why might we want to reappraise our thoughts? Well, the idea is quite simply that because sometimes our thoughts can reflect cognitive distortions. Sometimes our thoughts don't necessarily reflect the whole picture or the whole reality of a situation. And that's really at the heart of what cognitive distortions are. To provide a formal definition, we can think of cognitive distortions as systematic thought patterns that distort perceptions of reality, especially under stress. The idea here is that our brain is this wonderful construct that helps us navigate this increasingly complex world around us. A lot of times it makes shortcuts in our thinking and our interpretations of the world around us. And sometimes those shortcuts are helpful, and sometimes those shortcuts can be unhelpful. And when we're under a lot of stress and we're feeling burnt out and with a lot of anxiety, we might be more likely to have these systematic thought patterns that can distort reality in a way that isn't necessarily as helpful. Now, the easiest way I have found to talk about cognitive distortions is to just jump into some examples of what they can look like in the workplace. So here I'm going to talk about 6 different common types of cognitive distortions and then provide some more concrete examples. Just to note that these are just 6 types. There are a lot more out there, but these are just 6 sort of common ones that we see people report a lot that are quite common experiences in general. The first is all or nothing thinking. So in here, our thinking pattern tends to view a situation, a person, or an event in either or terms. So I'm going to see things in terms of categories. Sometimes those categories might be extreme. Everything is either kind of all or nothing, yes or no, good or bad kind of thing. A second type of common cognitive distortion is ignoring the positives. So here I might tend to just disqualify or dismiss or just completely ignore any positive experience or positive event, or insist that they just don't really count. They're not as important as other kinds of experiences. Assuming my feelings reflect the entire reality. This is one where if I feel a certain way, if I have a certain reaction or emotion to something, that must mean that it fully reflects the truth of that situation, and that I'm going to assume that that feeling is going to then guide my reality, guide my attitudes and my judgments about that situation. So I'm going to act based on that feeling. Labeling, putting a fixed global label, usually negative, on myself or others. So kind of assigning a term that's not particularly positive or nice to myself or to someone else, and just kind of qualifying them with a single label. Tunnel vision. Here, I pay attention to one or a few details, and I fail to see the larger picture. I fail to see the broader image of what's going on. I'm so honed in on one aspect of a situation or one aspect of something that I'm failing to see the rest of it. And should statements. So I tell myself that events, people's behaviors, and my own attitudes should be the way that I expect them to be, not the way that they necessarily are. What might these look like in the workplace? So those were kind of the definitions of some common categories, but what might these look like if I'm just going about my day-to-day life, doing my work, talking to people, talking to coworkers, thinking and reflecting on my own work? How might these creep up in my thinking? Some examples might look like, I made a mistake in my presentation, therefore it was a total failure. Here, the idea is that, I had this whole presentation, maybe 99% of it was good, or maybe in this webinar I'm doing right now, I'll tell myself, oh, I made a mistake on that one slide. Therefore, the whole thing was a bust. The whole thing was just pointless and terrible, and everybody hated it. So this is an example of all or nothing thinking. Things are either good or bad. It's either a success or a failure, that kind of thinking. I'm a loser is a pretty clear and straightforward example of labeling yourself. Rather than viewing yourself as a complex individual, you kind of take one label, that in this case is negative, and assign it to yourself and use that label to qualify the complexity that is you. Getting promoted is all that matters. This is an example of tunnel vision. So here the promotion matters more than anything else. Every single thing else gets reduced to a value of 0. Promotion gets increased to a value of 100, and kind of seeing things with that tunnel vision view there. I feel embarrassed, so that pitch must have gone badly. This is an example of assuming my feelings reflect the entire reality. If I feel a certain way, let's say I feel embarrassment, that must mean that something must have gone badly, because otherwise I wouldn't be feeling embarrassed. He doesn't mean it, he's just being nice. So ignoring the positives. I certainly myself do this. I'm just going to throw that out there. But this idea of someone compliments you and just kind of, it's easy to dismiss the compliment, to just say, well, that's not, maybe they were just being nice, or they were just trying to, get me into a good spirit or something. This is an example of ignoring the positives, kind of automatically dismissing a positive statement and saying that it's not as valid as other ones, or wouldn't be as valid as, let's say, a negative one. She's bossy, so labeling other people. And they should have liked my idea, they're just wrong. So a should statement here, indicating that because something didn't go away that I thought it should have gone, that it's right or wrong, or that it's not reflecting the actual reality of the situation. So I want to take a quick moment just for us, we've talked about cognitive distortions, talked about different types, what they could look like when they pop up into our thinking during the day. I want to take a moment and just kind of couch this within our own personal experiences. So take a moment to think of a time in the last few months where you felt stressed or overwhelmed, and it can be at whatever intensity. For some, this might have been just kind of a minor peak in stress. For others, it might have been a day that really stood out as just being very high stress and being very overwhelmed. Really hone in on what that moment in time was. Where were you when you felt that way? What were the different factors at the time that might have been contributing to that? And I want you to think of a single thought that you can recall having during that time that feels like it may have been a cognitive distortion, now that you are a little bit more familiar with what a cognitive distortion looks like. For example, maybe you had the thought, things will never get better at work. Or I'm never going to get back to the levels of productivity that I was before the pandemic. Or any number of different thoughts. Just try to hone in on one single thought that you can recall having during that time. You don't need to share it yet or share it at all, but just kind of recall to mind for yourself what that thought might have been. And then reflect, how did this thought make you feel? And if you're comfortable doing so, you can enter just a single word in chat that describes how that thought made you feel in that moment. I'm seeing angry, frustrated, helpless, hopeless, burnt out, unhappy, impatient, lost. These are great words to describe some of these complex feelings. A lot of helpless, overwhelmed. Procrastinated, underestimated, unappreciated, powerless, might affect extremely, needed a break. So some of these cognitive distortions might have then led to other kinds of thoughts or feelings about what the way this is making me feel. What does that make me feel like I need to do next, kind of thing? Unfamiliar, disappointed. These are, again, great words. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think they really do a great job of capturing just the complexity of the human emotion and human emotion process, right? A lot of times it's really interesting to just sit with the idea that a single thought, a single interpretation that we can have about the world around us, about our work, about our home, whatever the case might be, can make us feel in these ways, can have such powerful emotions attached to them. And in some cases, distressing emotions that kind of make us really just take a step back and be like, wow, this is a very powerful experience. Kind of, to me, highlights the importance of our thinking and why this area of resilience might be particularly helpful to look at. Thank you so much again for sharing. Hopeless, but at the same time hopeful. Mixture of emotions, definitely understandable. Thank you so much. You now want to pause. So I've introduced cognitive distortions and started thinking more intentionally about how our thought processes in our day-to-day life can affect our emotional experiences and subsequently our behaviors and our life and the work. And I want to turn it over to Sofiane to talk a little bit about his reflections on some of these topics.
Thank you, Katia. Thanks very much. It was very reflective and useful. I hope you can all hear me. Well, one of my findings from this small part is that the emotions are very contagious. Like, looking at all the words that were used in the chat, it was almost impacting my mood. So this shows how important and how quick the emotions spread in the workplace. Well, maybe a bit about me. I'm leading a leadership development at SABIC globally. So, you know, my role is to make sure we have the right leaders for now and the future, and I operate in different regions. One of my reflections from the last year on resilience is that I see two main cognitive distortions, if I may use the word now. One having to be with the fact that the leader needs to be strong and show up as a very strong leader and therefore have the answers. I think this has been challenged during the pandemic, knowing that we're facing a challenge that has no clear answer from the past, has been a clear challenge. And I think a lot of leaders have been invited to rethink how, you know, how they must show up as leaders. The other part, the other cognitive distortion that I've seen a lot in the workplace is that I need to solve it alone. You know, I am the leader, I am the hero, and all the pressure is on me. And I think, again, a lot of leaders have been challenged to that, but I also saw some of the leaders, you know, that couldn't escape from that kind of cognitive distortion. So probably a reappraisal will be very helpful. I mean, overall, I think that in leadership development, resilience has been a blind spot for a couple of years. It's not a new topic for sure, but it's probably been underestimated, and maybe a pandemic needed to happen to really help us realize that. I would say that when I reflect on the Saudi market, I think there's probably a quality of life that is arguably higher here from a social support. Most people are part of large families, and they really find a lot of support at home. And while this is being a clear strength, I also think that this creates a blind spot where people feel like, no matter what happens, I have a very strong support and a very strong family, and I'll get away from the pandemic. And I think in very extreme situations, sometimes social support is not enough. Because the emotional part of resilience and the mental part of resilience is something that is very individual. So I think there's definitely room to embed that a bit more in leadership development practices. In my company, this is what we've been doing. And really, we didn't make any assumptions. We reached out to our top 150 leaders and asked them, like, what are the topics that are really a challenge for you, whether it has to do with a global disruption of the supply chain or, customers or whatever. And, what happened is that in 95% of the cases, their main concern was how to manage my emotions, how to interact with my teams, how to keep the morale of the teams, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very emotional and mental challenge. So definitely reappraisal is a spot on. I think another aspect of a practice I see in leadership development is that, we hear so much about vulnerability and humility. And I think for me to be resilient, you need to be first humble about what's going on. You need to accept that sometimes the situation may be stronger than you, and you need to look at things differently. I think when leaders get stuck into their feeling of being a superhero, they struggle with adapting and with showing resilience at work.
Sofian, to that point that you just had, there's a chat question that says, do you mind explaining what does a strong leader mean? And I think you're talking about that in the context of perhaps as a superhero. And I referred to it as Katia. I was like, I'm sort of tired of hearing about resilience because I'm tired of trying to keep a stiff upper lip. And she was like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about being prepared to be adaptive and responsive, given all of these things. So maybe more on what you mean by a strong leader.
Well, absolutely. I think that's a spot on. I think overall, even before the pandemic, there is a shift from a leader that is doing it all, having the answers, having a plan, is prepared to face everything, to a leader that is really very self-aware and still being very driven, but at the same time being very humble, and therefore willing to experiment and question the assumptions that she or he may have. So, I think what we see as a strong leader is typically a very alpha, assertive, self-confident, and that myth or that, I'm not saying this is not a true part of the leader, but I don't think that is enough. I think we are facing challenges that we have never seen, and therefore we need to have the humility to experiment and move very fast. So I would say that, what a strong leader is now is very different from what it used to be.
Very helpful. And there's one other chat question that comes right into what you were just speaking about, which is, the question is about how to, that tasked with business objectives that you're expected to deliver, but it's not open to accept failure and therefore not accepting support mechanisms, which can seem like a personal failure. How do you break that cycle?
That's absolutely important. Basically, leaders do not operate in vacuum. They operate in a system, and they're part of a network, and they're part of a whole system. So I think trying to solve leadership by just looking at individuals may be restrictive. In my company, what we do to address that, for example, is that we say everyone is a leader. As soon as you join the company, you are expected to display leadership. And that somehow removes the burden on the leader to have all the answers, because every potential team member may bring part of the answer and collaborate with others. So part of how we address that is we remove the burden of the leader needs to have the final answer, and we try to encourage leaders to be challenged by the teams as well, and make it safe for people to speak up. That's one of the things. The other piece is really about building meaningful connections. I think leaders are much more effective when they operate together. If you think about roaming, and the impact of having everybody roaming at the same time and being aligned. I just think solving leadership also is about looking at teams and networks, etc. Hope that answers the question.
It did for me, thank you. And I think you've got a thank you for the clarification.
So back to you, Katya.
Thank you, Sophia. So now that we've talked about cognitive distortions, the second half of what I wanted to share with you today is, so what can I do about it is really what it's answering. So, we manage our thoughts, and the idea here is that how we manage our thoughts can impact our experiences, just as we just saw that how we think about the world around us and how those thoughts impact our behavior can be very important as well. And the main point here is that effectively managing distressing thoughts can help us move toward our best self. One of the great resilience practices that can be quite impactful. And this is where cognitive reappraisal comes in. I alluded to this before, but I want to provide a more structured definition for it. Cognitive reappraisal is essentially reinterpreting an emotionally evocative situation in a different, usually a more balanced way. So here we're going to consider in our own thinking, what information might we be missing? What information was I not considering? What are some assumptions that I'm making? A lot of times when we have an interpretation, we have a lot of assumptions that we're making and we just don't really recognize them as assumptions. We just kind of treat them almost inherently as truths in that moment. Don't realize that that is an assumption that could actually be challenged if we think about it a little bit more. And then new perspectives. What are some new perspectives that I might be missing that I haven't considered? That because it may be of something like tunnel vision, I'm so honed in on this one piece of it that I'm not really seeing the bigger picture, or I'm not considering how other people might see this picture. And this is really what reappraisal is all about. The idea is that we challenge our thinking. We're training our minds to be more flexible, more open-minded to different perspectives, to become more flexible in thinking, so that when we have a distressing situation, something that causes us distressing emotions, we are able to challenge it, look at it from different angles. How can I reappraise? So in the moment when I have one of those thoughts, what can I do to start challenging that thinking? There are a lot of different questions that you can ask yourself. I'm highlighting just 3 as an example, but these are questions that you could get into the habit of just cultivating in your own thinking, getting into the habit of asking these questions to yourself when you're noticing yourself experience a cognitive distortion. So what are some alternate explanations for this situation? What are some reasons for my interpretation of this situation that I might be not considering, or that I may not have noticed? What are some external factors that might affect the situation? A common one that I hear is, oh, what am I bringing to this situation that I might not be fully aware of? Maybe I'm having the thought, this class is useless or something, and that's kind of my distortion. What might be affecting my interpretation of that? Maybe I'm really hungry and I tend to not really want to pay attention when I'm really hungry. Maybe I'm sleep deprived and I just have a very kind of much more difficulty concentrating when I haven't had a good night of sleep. What might be going on, elsewhere from other situations or other factors that I'm not really considering in this very moment that might make that initial interpretation not 100% true. If I surveyed others, how might they interpret the situation? This is one of my favorite ones because I think it helps really pull us out of ourselves for a moment. If I were to ask my friend, hey, this happened, and what would you think if this happened to you, for example? Maybe my friend might bring a different perspective. Or if I were to ask a colleague, hey, this happened in a meeting today, how might how might you interpret this if this happened to you? I've done this myself. I've been very surprised at seeing how I might assume that everybody would have had the same interpretation, but actually a lot of people have different interpretations, and they consider and weigh different elements of a situation differently. And I've learned a lot from just being able to really think about getting outside of myself. What might that look like? The idea is that after you challenge your initial thought, your initial interpretation, you really kind of consider what information you're missing, what assumptions were you making, what are some new perspectives you might be able to consider. Then you generate a new, more balanced thought that reflects new information and perspectives, that reflects all the information that you just gathered from that reappraisal process. Noticing, here we go. Couple of questions. I'm going to put those over to the side to make sure I remember them later. How cognitive distortions and cognitive reappraisal relates. How does this look like in real time? So let's walk through an example together. Here, let's say that I have the cognitive distortion, I'll never manage my time well. I've been going through a lot of tight deadlines recently. I'm noticing that I'm not moving as quickly as I normally move with my work. And I just have this thought, I'll never manage my time well. My reaction, if I choose, if I have this distortion, I'm under a lot of stress, it's a stressful period, my reaction might be that I believe that thought is true, or I assume that it's true. I don't engage in reappraisal, I just kind of buy into the thought in the moment. My reaction is that I believe that's true. I actually will, in fact, never manage my time well. It just feels like I'm never going to manage my time well, so I'll never manage it well. What's the outcome of this reaction of believing or assuming that the thought is true? Well, first, I might feel demotivated. I might feel, well, if I'm never going to manage my time well, then what's the point? I might feel less compassionate toward myself. I might be less able to focus on tasks. You know, if I'm never going to manage my time well, then maybe I'm inherently a little bit less motivated to focus on tasks because, well, I'm never going to manage it well anyway, kind of thing. And these can have behavioral effects down the road, right? If I feel demotivated, might I be less engaged with my work? Might I kind of deprioritize my work? And then what are the kind of down the line, downstream effects of that we could also think about or brainstorm. And what if instead I had this thought, I'll never manage my time well, and I choose to engage in the process of cognitive reappraisal? So I start challenging that thought. I ask myself, you know, okay, well, are there times where I've managed my time well? Let's say over the last week or so. Well, yeah, I met, you know, that deadline, and I was able to handle these 3 other situations that came up while I was trying to work on this task, and I got those emails and those responses sent out. So really, I actually had times where I did manage my time well. I'm just struggling with this one piece of my work right now, so it feels like a big part of my work. So it's making me feel like I never do this. I never manage my time well. But I'm able to remember times when I actually do it well. Oh, and my boss gave me feedback that I'm pretty good with time management. And I might have dismissed that, but there's another piece of evidence that I do, in fact, have times where I manage my time well. Now, the reaction here is after applying cognitive reappraisal to the thought, might have the reaction, well, actually, more often than not, I actually do meet timelines and prioritize effectively. When I consider all the evidence together, it's unfair to say that I'll never manage my time well. Well, first of all, it's a prediction about the future. But second of all, this belief about, you know, managing my time well maybe isn't all or nothing. Maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I actually have times where I manage my time well. And what might be the outcome of engaging with reappraisal in this situation instead? I might feel more motivated, might feel more compassionate toward myself. I'm not so hard on myself. I give myself credit for what I have done. I'm better able to focus on tasks. The idea that, you know, I'm capable, I can do this, I actually do meet timelines and prioritize effectively when I'm giving myself credit for it, might lead to a more motivating force where I am able to a little bit more easily get back into that swing of motivation and tackling my tasks. What does the research say about cognitive distortions and cognitive reappraisal? So now that we've talked about what are cognitive distortions and what is cognitive reappraisal, what does it look like? How could we apply it to a cognitive distortion? What does the research say? From our own research at CCL, We found that cognitive distortions can impact how burnt out or satisfied we are from work. And this is even after we control for differences in work circumstances. So even after we take into account how your organizational support looks like for you personally, how ambiguous you feel your role is that you're working in, et cetera, even after we take into account some of those, we're still seeing the significant correlation between frequency of cognitive distortions at work and how burnt out or how satisfied you are with your job. We also see evidence that emotion regulation strategies, such as cognitive reappraisal, which is one that we assessed in this study, can serve as helpful tools for managing the relationship between these thoughts and burnout specifically. And burnout stands out to me as just, again, an emotional state that a lot of us have been coping with for the last year or so. And so particularly promising to think about how helpful cognitive reappraisal or something like cognitive reappraisal could be. So how can I integrate cognitive reappraisal into my life? At the end of the day, when I introduced those 8 different resilience practices as kind of practical, concrete ways in which to infuse more resilience into your daily life, how could I do that with reappraisal? A first step is to watch yourself talk, right? We can't really start challenging cognitive distortions if we never notice them or if we never acknowledge that they're there. And so a good first step is to become a little bit more aware, a little bit more mindful of what your self-talk looks like, what you're telling yourself as you're going through the day. A good tip here that I found to be helpful is notice when you're feeling particularly stressed or particularly burnt out, or you had a bad day and you're sharing with your loved ones or your friends, today was rough. Thinking back on your experiences and your thought process that day, what came up? What assumptions might you be making or might have you made throughout the day? Usually those are times when we can look back, reflect on our thinking. We might be able to notice a cognitive distortion or two that occurred during the day that we might have not noticed in the moment when it was happening. Once you're able to identify maybe a thought or an interpretation that seems like it's consistent with a cognitive distortion, you can get into the habit of challenging it. That's really just getting into the habit of the reappraisal. So you can do this any way you want. You can write down 3 challenging questions, either on your phone, on a reminder app, or on a Post-it note if you're old-fashioned like I am, put it on your monitor, and you can just get into the habit of training yourself to think about these questions when you're thinking about your own assumptions. So for example, these 3 we looked at before, but it might be something like, what are some alternate explanations for this situation? What are some external factors that might affect the situation? How might others think if I ask them? And the more that you do that, the more that you use those questions to challenge your thinking, the more habitual it becomes, the more easy it becomes to access those questions when you're in that moment of kind of high stress and really struggling with managing some of the thinking patterns that might be there. Now to bring it all back. So again, resilience. 8 helpful practices. We just today honed in on one, cognitive reappraisal. It's one that I'm particularly passionate about, given my prior work, one that I think and have seen firsthand can be especially helpful in the workplace and outside of the workplace. And again, one that is concrete and behavioral. So one that you can think about trying to incorporate into your daily life if it's something that you're interested in, getting into the habit of challenging your thinking. Now, applications, for those of you who are curious, how can we apply this work leadership development wise, just to give you a little bit of a flavor. As Sophia mentioned, resilience as a leadership development concept has been around, and certainly at CCL, it is a part of many of our programs. This particular framework or model that I've introduced is currently being integrated and expanded and really explored as a particularly helpful way to give folks a tool set to use for and thinking about how to cultivate resilience. We also are interested in digital tools. How can we, especially in our increasingly virtual environment, especially recently, how can we use digital tools to help create this culture of leaders cultivating resilience, help people incorporate some of these practices into their daily life? One example that I have been working on is actually a virtual exercise. It's called the Cognitive Distortions Explorer. And it's essentially a place where you can log in, you can access a virtual card deck. So these are just examples of what the cards might look like. And you can see on one side is a type of cognitive distortion, and on the back is the definition of that type of cognitive distortion. And you can learn about the different types of cognitive distortions via a card exercise. We also have cards that are examples of distortions. We have cards that are examples of reappraisal exercises or questions, and then different exercises or ways of having people both learn the concepts and practice applying reappraisal to the cognitive distortions. So this is just one way. It's a bit of a gamification way of doing it, but it's also just a way to kind of virtually jump in and really get to start exploring some of the concepts yourself. And through these, to start thinking more about, okay, how could this look like in my daily life? Thank you again for your attention. I will now turn it back to Sophia for some more insights.
I think Cheryl has something to say, but she's on mute.
I'm on mute, sorry. Sophia, just before you start, I thought there were a couple of questions that would be pertinent to ask maybe Katya and answer right now. And then the first one is, how do we prepare ourselves to generate new thoughts, Katya? It sounds like there's a bit of a, you have to stop and sort of disrupt yourself a little bit and maybe create a new habit.
Yeah, so the question is, how can we get into the habit of generating some of these thoughts? The first is, I really just think of it as a two-step process. So becoming more aware, and you, however you feel is going to help you do that. Brainstorm different ways to do it. So for example, I know some people who set a reminder on their phone, and literally once a day randomly it pings them, what is your thinking like today? How's your thinking going? And it's something is that might work for some people. And it's a very broad question, but it really encourages them to stop and reflect for a moment on, how was my thinking today? You know, was I going around and feeling a certain type of emotion? What might have been some of the interpretations that prompted that emotion? And it's a moment of self-reflection that we might not have otherwise had if I didn't have a prompt like that encouraged me to think about my thinking. For others, it's pausing. So I know for some people, before they react to something, like if somebody, a colleague says something in a meeting and they're like, ooh, they notice themselves having a reaction to it, they might just take a commitment to pause for 5 seconds and to just examine their thing. Okay, what am I interpreting right now? Let me think about what I'm about to say. Is my interpretation reflecting, multiple views, or is it kind of a reactive interpretation in that moment? And just that 5-second pause is a helpful way to notice that thinking. Those are just a couple of examples, but the first overall step is you have to kind of become a little bit more intentional about noticing your thinking. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to challenge your thinking, right? If you don't even know exactly or are not fully aware of what your assumptions are. The second part is really then the questioning. Being a little bit more open and comfortable with challenging your own assumptions, assuming that, hey, I might have had a good reason to have this reaction, but is that the reaction that reflects the entire reality of the situation? Am I looking at things, with an open mind from multiple perspectives? Or am I jumping to commit to one interpretation, regardless of what it is? And getting into the just cultivating that cognitive flexibility. And one way to do that is through those questions, just becoming more in the habit of asking those questions. It takes work. I will say that. I wish that this PowerPoint slide magically allowed us all to just kind of become a little bit more aware of our thinking and challengers of our thinking. But it really does take an intentional commitment to, okay, my thinking is important, and becoming more aware of what I'm thinking and what my interpretations are and how I can challenge that could be really helpful and something I want to commit to doing. I think that's really at the heart of cultivating that habit.
I think one of the things I've also done, and there are a couple places where when I'm stressed, I fall into a certain habit, and it might be attributing intent to one of my colleagues that is not their intent. And it might be, he never listens to me. And then I have to step back and say, well, in this situation, was he listening to you? What might else be going on there? And is it truly he never listens to you? When was the last time you had a great dialogue? And so I've tried to set up trigger thoughts that are like, okay, that one you have to go step back and examine because it's getting in the way of the relationship. And I think that has been helpful for me as a practice, I guess I would say, to try and change, especially when I'm stressed. Sophie, there's another question that's come up that's really, I think we can all participate in, but you particularly from the practice of when are teams signaling to us that they're under duress, and how do we pick up those small changes that give clues that a team member, someone is under stress? Can we see that, and how do we react to that?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, I think, thank you, Katia. I think what you're describing is like my daily life. I guess for the people with us here, it's probably the same. I think in addition to what you mentioned, Katia, is there's a lot of self-discipline into asking questions and looking at our own assumptions. But I also think that others can help us into that. And one of the very strong practices is really to ask for feedback, especially on those things, and show that you have the openness to be challenged on your own assumptions. I think that's also very powerful. To your question, Cheryl, I think there's a couple of clues that clearly indicate that people may be struggling sometimes, and when everything is online, it's just like a silence for a long period of time. So, I think for leaders, you don't, jump to an interpretation of what this silence means, but just, checking in with people very informally, like we used to do when we were working together in the same place. Doing this virtually, I think really helps verify. What I also see is, and coming from France, we tend to be very ironic about things. But a higher than usual level of irony in people's comments can be a sign of something is not really, well there. And actually, it could be a cognitive distortion about something going on. Some levels of negativeness into our cognitive distortions. I think as leaders, we should not try to remove that. Actually, we should give space for that because it really gives us clue. And if we don't create a space where it's safe to show those cognitive distortions, what we have is people refraining for showing them in public, but they're still having those internal resilience challenges. So we need to be able to pay attention to that and actually build on that and engage in a dialogue. I think, that's overall how, I feel probably lack of productivity for some of us, but I guess the rules of productivity have changed. Sometimes a hyper productivity may be a sign that something is not well. We've noticed that during the COVID, people are working longer than expected, in average 1 hour more than what they used to do. And as managers, you want to recognize the hard work, but you also want to make sure that this is sustainable and that is not impacting people's lives. So, an email that has been sent to you at 10:30 p.m. Maybe just a clue that, maybe I will have that conversation with my team member.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's also an interesting question here about being able to read body language virtually, and that it's hard to understand if others are sad or happy simply by their voices. And so I think there's some nice, just a really good call out. I will admit that a signal for my team is, I've noticed that when I start receiving emails very late at night, that is a clear signal that things are not going well, because it might be that moms have to juggle children during the day because they're not in school, and I need to be thinking about different practices for that. Another one is, they aren't going to say it, but the workload's too high, and those are all signs of stressors, or they just couldn't be productive during the day and waited till night. All of those things those have been signals to me that I've been able to pick up. What do you think about this? The inability to see people's body language and picking up on signals in that way.
So maybe I may be sharing that in our company, we started to train our leaders on virtual body language. And that's very promising, because there is an artificial intelligence tool that is looking at video conferences and how people listen, like the time it takes for them to listen and the time of talks. And I think we starting to know what a good conversation looks like, from how much you listen, how much you look at each other, how many questions do you ask, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still new, but it's very promising. There are some wonderful technology there. I think one of the things I've noticed is people not putting their videos, and it really depends on what your culture is, etc. We value the human touch, and sometimes leaders will say, we cannot see you, can you put our videos on? But when some people are not comfortable putting the videos, they may have 2-3 children around them, and they may just be in a setup that is not really appropriate, and we should give space for that. We should be more tolerant, and I should not say we should, because it's a cognitive distortion. But yeah, I think that's one of the things I can reflect on in terms of body language. Sometimes people being silent for a very long time and just saying hello and goodbye at the end can be a sign that it happened to me in my own team, where one of the members really was usually much more active, and at the end of the meeting I've asked if somebody was wrong, and he apologized. He said, well, I had to multitask with the family around me, etc., so I couldn't be as engaged as usual. And overall, I think tolerance is, I think COVID has taught us to become much more tolerant of this.
There's also a question that I think your perspective would be really helpful on about, you talked to some global things, but in the region, there's an interesting question about how do we ensure that people are confident and productive in their work, and some reflection that discussions of and tone should be inclusive of empathy, sympathy, listening, and redesigning the road towards achieving goals, since changes are more hard on employees. Is there any perspectives on that perspective?
Yeah, well, my first perspective is on the question itself. How do you ensure that people are productive? My question will be, do you really need to ensure that people are productive? Leaders, especially in the region, I think there's quite a hierarchical culture where leaders tend to be in control, and the way they exercise control is through face-to-face relationships. So there's a shift in that feeling of having control, the work we've been doing is that we really have conversations with leaders about we challenge their need to be in control, the other side of it is, how do you build trust? Because you need to feel less in control, and you probably need to build trust more, and it's all about being proactive as opposed to saying, how do I keep the control? I think leaders need to shift differently into, okay, how I keep happiness of others, how I keep connectiveness, how do I create a safe space? And there needs to be a tolerance. I'm aware of a few companies saying that, we know that all people are at least 2-3 hours a day are not necessarily on the desktop, and they're doing other stuff, etc. And at the end, if they are able to deliver what they expected to deliver, I think we should focus less on that. Again, we should, but we've done a lot of work on that. And some of the leaders really were sharing stories about how they shifted into not trying to be in control, but trying to be productive, trying to be engaging. And in that sense of, you need to ensure things, you need to drive accountability, and you need to, again, the fact that the leader needs to be in control and be assertive and have all the answers is shifting away with the gig economy. You just really focus on the end result, and the how we get to the end result is no longer relevant.
There's a company we're working with, they'll be in a webinar with us, but they had talked about creating a virtuous cycle of well-being and doing the right thing. And there's a comment in here from someone who has children who, they know that team members are working on campus, but their children are attending schools at home. and started using their phones a lot to keep up with their children and not saying anything because I understand. You are being empathetic to the situation. We had another situation in the US where a corporation had a very large manufacturing facility in Texas. You may or may not have read about the horrible winter storm that killed over 111 people who literally froze to death in Texas because the power grid went out in Houston. And this person, the CEO managing that very large facility, despite any legal ramifications, any liability ramifications, opened up the facility, which still had power, to any employee who needed a place to stay and be warm and be fed for those 3 days. And, he did the right thing in the situation for his group of people. So it was, I think, that responsiveness that is being talked about here is also important as we address the many, many, many stressors that are on people right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe another reflection, and it's not directly related to leadership development, but what I've noticed is that some companies have been very effective in cutting through the whole bureaucracy and providing tools to enable people to be productive as they should. Like that a lot of companies have IT security firewalls that are very strict and that do not, for example, allow Zoom calls, or and how do you really help your people have conversations with external suppliers, etc. And sometimes you have so many levels of approval to secure a tool. And I've seen companies shifting into a kind of crisis mode where they show their employees that whatever you need, we're going to work hard to provide it to you in a timely way. And in some companies, including mine, the bureaucracy is an energy drainer. And it's usually before COVID, it's an energy drainer. But during a pandemic, you don't want people to be, demoralized about the fact that they need to wait for 5 approvals just to have access to an online tool or those kind of examples. So I think the ability of leaders to cut through the bureaucracy and focus on what's essential is quite important as well.
I think we're now open for Q&A or any other reflections from you or Sofiane as we think about this.
Thank you very much, Cheryl and the rest of the team. This has been quite educational, and I'm seeing a lot of great questions, to be honest, from the team, from the participants. And I would like to draw on one of them. And I think we got a number of good questions from Mohammed Taiba. He mentioned a good question on, can you benchmark resilience? So Dr. Katia, anything on this? Have we actually looked at this from CCL's research and point of view?
The idea here about having sort of like a standard or like kind of model, a role model, I think was the term used in the question. This is a great question. I love this question personally. And I'm just gonna start by saying that. Resilience has been assessed in a number of different ways traditionally. The most common way that I've seen it assessed is we'll ask people, how well do you think you respond to adversity? And we kind of have people rate themselves on that. Other approaches to resilience focus a little bit more on behavior. So what are you doing to cultivate resilience and try to get at it from a behavioral perspective? I personally think that all of these are important. I think it's the beliefs you have about yourself, about how resilient, in quotes, you are, or how well, going on our definition, you respond adaptively to challenges. What you believe about yourself is one way of looking at it. The behaviors that you do on a day-to-day basis to cultivate resilience is another way of looking at, where might I see myself right now on the continuum of resilience. And I think that those are going to look really different for different people. You can get 2 people who rate themselves a 9 out of 10 on resilience as a concept, and their behaviors might look very different, but they're rating themselves very highly on that. And so I think it's a little bit tricky to to benchmark traditionally, just because it's such a personal, at least when you're looking at individual resilience, it's just such a complex construct that can look quite different for different people. Different people can demonstrate their resilience in different ways. That being said, I don't think it's impossible to try to get better at quantifying it. And that's actually one of my interests in research, is to try to explore how can we better assess resilience. We have these 8 practices. We could ask how people are doing with these 8 practices. We could ask how they handle challenges. You know, we can get more from that angle. How do you handle beliefs about challenges? How do you respond to stressful situations? You know, we can get a lot of different questions that kind of tap into resilience as a whole, but I think it's quite complex and perhaps not as straightforward to benchmark personally. That would be my answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Katya. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to add that, Katya, I think you took it also from a very individual point of view, which is absolutely true. Your adaptability and the practices that you value. And someone may find that running 10 miles is what they value, and someone else might say, writing in a gratitude journal is my practice, but it makes me adaptable. Another way to think about measuring resilience is the way in which an organization or a team leader supports your ability to practice resilience. And so what are you putting in place? And there are, I think, some things like an organizational work-life balance indicator that are being developed, and some other things like that, to say, how is the organization supporting resilience practices for their organization? And I think that's very important to think about as well for teams and companies.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I will echo what Dr. Cheryl said. Today we talked about how a leader can manage her or his own resilience, but the ability of a leader to spot some resilience challenges within others and ask those questions to others and challenge the others on their own resilience is contagious if you think about it. It's not really about just me surviving, but really enabling others to be resilient. Again, I don't know how you can measure it separately, but I think we all have, especially in the region, examples in our families, our mothers, our aunts, our sisters, or whatever, that are great role models of resilience.
Absolutely, Sufyan, absolutely. So I see a lot of great questions, and I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions they would like to pose. Maybe we can take one more question, and then before we close. So I think there was a good question from Muhammad. Also, he's talking about AI effect on everybody, leaders and organizations. How will that affect us? It is certainly being instrumental and helpful, as Sufyan mentioned in your example about reading the body language and spotting resilience issues. But also AI is also coming in and taking a lot of roles that people usually previously have been taking. So how is that affecting us?
I'll speak to that a little bit. Sure. I'll speak to both some of the positives and the negatives. So one of the ways in which AI is very helpful in leadership development is the personalization of content and experiences to help you learn what you need to learn. And this is extraordinarily important in the new apps that are being developed. We're certainly in the thick of that. It's important in the way that you think about a virtual reality simulation or a tool like what you're talking about, Sufyan. We've experimented with tools like Voice Vibes and Pitch Vantage to help people improve how they show up as a leader. How do other people interpret you, what you're saying? And so there's some advantages to that. It certainly helps with the automation of dull and repetitious tasks that people would rather not have to do if they weren't, if that was not the only thing available. And a greater reliance is pushing a greater reliance on human decision-making and interpretation of information and results. So those are good things to think about. The flip side of the coin that I think are important to think about are the ethics of AI. And so what data is being used to train the AI, and how is that institutionalizing assumptions and biases that we've always had versus breaking them down and making us think in different ways. So that's a very important concept as well for the negative side. And then as far as taking roles are concerned, I think we're behind in being able to upskill our workers and our teammates and our colleagues to take on new roles. And I have to say that this push towards automation is going to continue to happen. Amazon is not going to stop building robots to pack boxes and trucks, right? They're not. And so what new things are going to be needed in the future, and how do we put those things in place and make it equitably available to everyone, so that we think a lot about higher education in the United States. Who has access to that? And what does higher education mean? And how do we make that more equitable so that someone in the Appalachian Mountains who doesn't have access to education has the opportunity that someone in the Northeast might have? So these are things we wrestle with a lot. It's a great question. And there's, because I'm in the thick of studying AI, I probably have too much to say, but those are some things that pop into my head right now.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Appreciate it. I think there's also a great comment from Sayed regarding, the positives that we see. There's a lot of positives around us, and it's really something that we should really pay attention to. And that will certainly help us to stay more resilient and more positive in our approach. I wanted I guess I wanted to take this to a close. I wanted to thank each and every one of you for making it to this great webinar, starting with the panelists, Dr. Cheryl, Dr. Katia, Sufyan, and the rest of the participants. Each and one of you, wanted to thank you for participating and to creating a lively discussions. This is the one of many webinars that we plan to run, inshallah, over this year. And we want to enrich the literature and the practice, our personal practice in leadership development through these webinars. I want to thank CCL, Lynn, Casper from the management team for making this happen. And hopefully, inshallah, we are going to see more of this coming very soon, inshallah. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.